Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Shakil Choudhury. Shakil is an award-winning educator and consultant with 25 years of experience in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. He coaches executive teams and facilitates intergroup conflicts. And today, we will speak about his book, Deep Diversity, a compassionate scientific approach to achieving racial justice. Shakil, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, Alain. Thank you for having me.
So, Shakil, I always feel a little bit of an extra pleasure when I'm speaking to a fellow Canadian. So, I don't know why I bring that up, but it's just in a world, the Anglophone world is so huge, and to speak to someone who is so close, it just give me one extra connection. I would like to speak about your book, but I wonder if we could speak a little bit about your background. How is it that you became interested in deep diversity, your studies, your background in general?
That's a complicated question. I'll try to give you the short answer, which is that I'm professionally trained as a teacher and as a school teacher. I worked in grade 7 and 8 middle school a lot in the Toronto District School Board for a number of years. And by passion, however, since my 20s, I've been described myself as an anti-racist educator, as a community organizer. So I've been involved in this work for a long time. And so what I would say is that my work is defined by my background and training in anti-racism and anti-oppression work. However, my work changed after I burnt out as a community activist. And in fact, it was just over 20 years ago after 9/11 where I did my last, at that time, bit of community organizing, and I burnt out. And it forced me to do some deeper work on myself, some healing work. And as I started doing that work, it made me realize that there was something I was missing in how I was doing racial justice work. And so I started exploring work around psychology and healing and really trying to understand myself. And as I understood myself more, I started to explore, well, the way I've been trained, which is historically looking at history and events and sociology and statistics, like all that's really, really important to understand racism and oppression, how we got here today. But it doesn't fully help us understand why humans do what they do. And that's the realm of psychology. And so I've been exploring psychology, neuroscience, and also been doing work around trauma training, and integrating all those pieces has really helped me create what I call the deep diversity framework to help us tackle racial justice so that we can go past the surface level conversations and help people move into their hearts, really, because this work is very emotional. And so if we just keep it at a cognitive level with just at the ideas and thinking ideas are going to fix the problem and help create justice, we've sort of missed the boat. And really the blocks to this work are emotional and unconscious. And so bringing that awareness into our work is really important. And so that's why Deep Diversity and the book that I wrote is a bit different and unique, because it integrates those pieces and says we can make change and we can do it, but we need to also be compassionate as we make change and understand a little bit of why humans do what they do, and why our biases are so prevalent, and why we have stereotypes. And half of the question is about nurture, how we've been socialized, but the other half is really about nature, our biological impulses, things that are underneath it, that are the hardware. We can't change the hardware, but we can change the software. In order to change the software, we need to understand what's at play, why it's so hard to socialize us outside of our in-groups, and why power dynamics are so hard to work through. So that's a little bit about my background and how deep diversity came to be. It's really been an iterative process of, 2.5 decades.
You started your book telling us that when you were younger, you spent part of your youth trying to pass as a white person. So first of all, where are you from and why were you trying to pass as a white person, and how much of that is in our society? I mean, we have heard of the term of colorism. We compare your book with Malcolm Gladwell, where he also talks about colorism in his native town. So how predominant is this? Oh, I want to be white, or I want to act like a white person.
Right. That's a great question. I love that you reference Malcolm Gladwell, because I'm very inspired by him. I grew up a couple of towns over from him, and his work has really inspired me in terms of taking complex ideas and bringing them forward so that everyone can access them. So I was born in Pakistan, and my family is from Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and immigrated to with my family here when I was like 5 years old to Canada, to small town North America. And I would say that, generally speaking, I didn't experience a lot of overt racism. I was a popular kid. I got along really well in high school. I was high achieving and did well academically, but I was involved in sports teams and band and student council. So I was one of those kids that was involved in everything. So life was pretty good. But it took me until well into my 20s to realize that there were things that, as much as I thought my life was happy and good, which it was in many ways, there was another part that I could not name, could not touch, and it was too painful. And that was that I had basically pushed everything away that had to do with my South Asian ethnicity, my Muslim upbringing. And I tried to draw everything towards me that was white and middle class, and tried to bury everything related to my cultural background, which is why my book, I'm very explicit. I grew up not just desiring whiteness, but part of me wanted to believe I was white. Well, of course, when you have a name like Shakil, pre-basketball era, it's not something that you're going to easily assimilate into. And so I was constantly reminded, well, where are you from? And I would say Hanover, and they would say, no, where are you really from? Where are your parents from? All that kind of questioning. So what was liberating and simultaneously painful to recognize is that as I started immersing myself in anti-racism work, I realized that I wasn't alone, that this experience of internalized racism is quite common. It wasn't just common when I was growing up in the 80s, it's common today. That if we come from non-dominant groups racially, it doesn't mean it's guaranteed we're going to have internalized racism, because there's many factors at play, but it's very common enough that there's a name for it. And it's not just about racism. People can internalize sexism, internalize heterosexism and homophobia, and so on. So yes, absolutely, that was part of my experience. It's still part of the experience of many, many people today, young people as well as adults. It's just that it becomes so unconscious, we don't even know. And we don't even know that we're code switching all the time. Mm-hmm. And so it's really important that we make that, that we become aware, because it can be very, it can be experience of erasure. We can erase parts of ourselves because the society itself is not amplifying or validating who we are.
So, I mean, in a society as multicultural as Toronto and Montreal, it is easy to detect if you have internalized racism or not. Some people know they have it, some people don't know that they have it. But in other, let's say, I don't know, Northern Quebec, how would they know that they have internalized racism when they don't have that much contact with people from other races?
You mean someone who's already minoritized and living in those contexts?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, they might not know.
Right. Okay.
Unless they start exploring unless they start being in conversation with other people, unless they are given permission to to speak about these things. So I'm often in very different contexts, and it's remarkable the number of adults as well as a number of young people that will come up to me after I've done a presentation or a workshop, and I'm in like North Ontario, or I'm, somewhere where it's small towns or whatever it is. And people will all of a sudden say, your story is my story. I didn't even know that until now. One woman on the East Coast of the US came up to me, and she said, and she was South Asian like me, and she said, I had no idea that this was going on for me. In fact, and she was in tears. She was saying, like, I realized that this is why I've been so irritated whenever issues around racism come up, because I've constantly aligned myself with white people. In fact, my husband's white. And she was really going through an emotional thing where she was like, she wasn't aware of the things that were driving her because they were unconscious. And this is why the more we can talk about it, the more people can validate it for us. And we often need validation from other people to go, oh, right, this is not just something that's happening to me. It's something that's systemic. It's something that is across not just one part of the country or one organization, but it's across the system. And that's what the research on implicit bias shows us. That's what sociological research has showed us for decades. So this is real. And so it really is through education, but it's also through opportunity for people to be able to if they're minoritized, if they're racialized, to be able to go, oh, wow, I can talk about this. So I think that's a big part of the work, is access and opportunity.
In my family, I was taught to have a prejudice against people who smoke pot and people who have tattoos, I don't know, in their bodies. And I know that this is wrong. Like I have girlfriends, friends who have tattoos, who smoke pot, but that prejudice that was ingrained in my mind since I was a little kid, and that it is not rational, is still in there. Now consciously, I know that it's wrong, or that it shouldn't have any place in my mind, but it's still there. How do I get rid of it?
Love that question. Well, I think your first step is just that awareness. And what I want to do is I want to stretch this to a bigger piece. It's not just about tattoos and piercings and so on. That this is how race gets categorized. And basically the research has shown that the darker your skin, the less you fit in. And this is universal, unfortunately. And colorism is universal. Anti-Black racism is universal. And so we see these things, and universal, not naturally, universal because of the history of colonization, because of white supremacy, because of structures. I mean, so as a result, this has become normalized. And so normalized that we don't even think about it. So there are many steps you can take. My book outlines them, but the first place you start with is accepting that this is a problem, that you've got a bias. The second thing is compassion, because as soon as you go, I've got bias in whatever category, it's going to bring up big feelings. Often the unconscious part of ourselves wants to deny it. So show up with compassion, like, I have been socialized into this. This is not my fault, but it is my responsibility. And so the compassion can help take responsibility. And then the third step is catch yourself in the act of your bias. So I tell many stories where I have caught myself where, for example, one story I tell where I basically negatively judge somebody who's got a last name that is not white sounding. And I do this, and I'm at optician store, and I'm given a reference, and I look at a business card, and the business card has a last name like Kianfar, which wasn't the actual name, but that basically I reacted and hesitated and had a negative response to the name, and even though it was given to me as a recommendation, I kind of thought, oh, I had this image of someone who was underqualified and someone who was quote unquote foreign sounding or foreign born or something like that. And I'm having this even though myself, I was born outside of North America. I have a South Asian last name. It is not white. So I've internalized that racism. So our bias shows up. So we've got to learn to catch ourselves in the act of bias, which is why I tell my stories where my bias has shown up, where my prejudice has shown up, where I have stereotyped, because we've got to normalize that that's just part of life. But what do we do about it? So step 3, catch yourself in the act. Step 4, you got to do something about it, which is self-learning. And that is, going further and doing more self-learning, whether it's reading books, whether it's immersing yourself in environments with the very people that you think negatively about, and recognizing also their humanity in the process. So, and then it's just rinse, wash and repeat, right? Like you've got to keep going through that cycle over and over again. It's a lifelong process, whether you are working on anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, whether you're working on your heterosexism, whether you are working on your classism or your anti-Semitism, that all of these things are lifelong processes. And to accept that that's the journey we're on, that's really important. So those are some of the steps you can take to undo your bias, but it's a commitment. And that's why the compassion comes in, because if you're just really hard on yourself, you're probably not going to get very far, because at a certain point, you'll just give up. And so compassion is like, right, this is not a race. This is not performance. This is actually because I think it's a better way to be in the world. And so you've got to be gentle and slow and be able to do that on a regular basis, because it's a lifetime's process. And the more you do it, the easier it becomes. That's the other part too.
I'm reading right now a book, the biography of Malcolm X. And when they are describing racism at that time, lynching and outright racism and discrimination, compared to the almost invisible systemic racism that is today, and is only highlighted by events like the George Floyd murder. But in general, it's not as overt as, this is the white people's bathroom and the Black people's bathroom as it was the time of Malcolm X era. Do you think that, I guess it's a rhetorical question. Isn't racism being reduced year after year? And it's only highlighted that we still have a lot of progress to make whenever we see something like George Floyd being murdered by a white policeman?
So I would answer that question like this, that racism exists in any form of oppression, exists in its overt forms and it's in its systemic forms. The overt forms of racism, fortunately, we are the beneficiaries of the civil rights era, where the ugly, thorny, spiky outer bark of racism was removed, or mostly removed. It's, even though it still shows up today, we're not having a conversation about whether it's right or wrong. People know that it's wrong and are horrified, and rightfully so. And on one level, tackling overt forms of racism is a little bit easier in the sense that we know who we're up against. It's the bigots, it's the overt bigots that we're up against. So it's easily identified who we have to challenge. Systemic is our legacy that we have to take on. The systemic is subtle. The systemic only shows up not just in George Floyd moments, but in through data, when we look at the experience of thousands and thousands of people. And then we can ask the question of like, oh, wait a minute, why are women systematically earning less than men? Whether you're dealing with frontline staff or Hollywood starlets, why is it that Indigenous people and people of color are systematically undertreated in the healthcare system? And why is it that in high schools, suspension expulsion rates have something disproportionately to do with the identity of the student rather than their behavior? So those are the kind of questions that come up. And what that implicates is there are fewer overt bigots we have to worry about. What it implicates is all of us, because all of us, regardless of our identity, can give priority and preference to white people over people of color. All of us, regardless of our background, can give priority and status and preference to women over men, to cisgender people over transgender people. All of us can do that, and we do it most often without our awareness. And so the systemic is really important to tackle, but it requires a different set of skills. And so in my book, what I talk about is we've got to develop pattern recognition skills. Okay, racial pattern recognition skills and psychological pattern recognition skills. So the racial pattern recognition skills. So when something like George Floyd happens, when even before George Floyd, any number of Black and brown men that have been systematically murdered because of over policing, right? That in those moments, racial justice and social justice activists would become enraged. Why? Because we knew it wasn't an isolated incident. We knew that there is a pattern. We are aware of that pattern. Most people are not. They're not aware of the patterns around in criminal justice around anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. They're not aware of the patterns in education. And so everything, if you don't know the pattern, it looks confusing. It's like if for example, you are an English speaker and you're learning Spanish for the first time. The letters are similar, but they don't have any meaning. If I'm reading it, I can't detect the pattern. But over time, I start learning to read and I can speak slowly because I'm starting to uncover the pattern that lies in the letters. Well, equally, we need to develop racial pattern recognition skills to be able to say, what are the overarching patterns that are at play? It's the same thing with gender. If we don't know that, for example, the gender-based patterns, a very common one is that women will be interrupted at meetings more than their male counterparts. If that's not even in my pattern recognition system, then if it happens in front of me, I'm not going to even recognize it. I'm going to make an excuse for it. That's what will happen. But if I know that it is a pattern, then I can be on the lookout for it. And this is what we have to be able to do is we've got to become system thinkers, because racism and sexism are system problems. They're systemic. And the key to understanding a system is to look for patterns and look for relationships. And that is an ongoing process. So that's, as we can dive more into that area, you're going to have more people recognizing and therefore able to not just recognize, but then interrupt. But frequently, we haven't taught people how to recognize the patterns because, well, there's a whole other conversation about how we teach racial justice, which isn't that great in the first place, but that's a whole other conversation. But when we do, people can recognize it. And we've got to apply the same structured process that we would, for example, to learning a new language. It is literally learning a new language, but learning to see differently, to sense differently, to feel differently, and to become adaptive in our thinking.
In your work, you see people who want to eliminate those systemic racism from their day-to-day life or to reduce it. But how do you deal with a society where let's say we have an ex-president who says, "Oh, all Mexicans are rapists, and I like grabbing women by you know where," and we have immigration from shithole countries, and millions of people go out there and vote for this individual who is just so blatantly racist and who likes to push down minorities. And there are millions and millions of them who, out of nowhere, they came out and said, yes, that's my guy. How do we deal with that?
Well, I'm glad you asked a very, very simple question that has a short answer. This is so complicated what you're asking. I can only offer some starting points. And the first starting point is to recognize that leaders like Trump don't come out of nowhere. Leaders like Trump, like he's unelectable in even the election before. He's unelectable 10 years earlier. He's a joke. Why isn't he a joke now? So one is that we have been living through 4 decades of neoliberal economics, which basically have grown the economies in places like Canada and the US. Our GDPs have grown 4 to 6 times. But at the same time, the rich have gotten richer, the poor have gotten poorer, and the middle class has shrunk. So people are desperate. And what history shows us over and over again is that desperation, that is the time when people who are exploitative, snake oil salesmen show up. And what are they frequently selling? They're selling hope, which is really just disguised hate. And they're always marginalizing people. So it is a pattern. It is a global pattern. It's a historical pattern. So what do we need to do in that time period? We need to make people feel more secure. One, so there's a big system thing that's going on. So things like universal basic income, which we've been sort of flirting with, that's essential. So for the people who are working on that, we need that. For people working on housing, we need housing, because basically when you reduce the uncertainty, people's willingness to buy into the garbage is totally reduced. To buy into the hate is reduced. So that's one, is there's a big structural thing. So all the people working in those areas, we need to support them. We need to get more security, help people feel secure, because guess what? Wages have basically stagnated across the industrialized world, certainly in Canada and the US, for almost 4 decades, right? So people are insecure. When we're insecure, we're going to get exploited. That's how it is. The second thing is, so like the 10% that are forever going to be in Trump's camp, we don't pay attention to them. What we've got to pay attention to is everybody else. Because here's the thing, for example, with the truckers convoy, the anti-vax truckers that just happened in Ottawa, of course, there's a whole bunch of like hardcores in there. They are anti-government. They want to burn it all down. They're using the vaccine thing as a entry point, but really they don't care. They're just using any opportunity to tear it down. So I'm still not that concerned about them. What I'm concerned about is all the people that feel like they're representing some part of their view or their concern. So if we dismiss all of them as oh, well, they're all just radicals, and they're all, you know, the what was the term Clinton used, the deplorables, then we are really doing a disservice, because we're basically feeding into the elitism that helped create some of that problem. Because the economic elitism is also who people are fighting up against. And frankly, I agree with that perspective. Elitism has gotten us here. So don't be elitist. It means stepping into the muck. It means actually going to conversation with people. So the 10% we might not be able to touch, but there's like 40 to 60% that we always can get access to. But that requires a lot of courage. It requires us to be not so ideological. It requires us to be compassionate, and for us to willing to be in conversation with people that are hard to be in conversation with, and to step into that to allow people to feel like they're being heard is a big part of the work. And unfortunately, in justice work, because we're so busy looking at the experience of marginalized people, we can lose sight of the fact that our own urgency and our own pain may be getting in the way of doing the bridge building that's also needed. So I think we need more bridge builders to be able to do that work. And that's really, really important. So those are sort of two meta strategies that I would think about that I think are really important to tackle Trumpism and the rising authoritarianism, because democracies, Western democracies like Canada and the US, we are under threat. And there's no guarantee that it is going to last unless we show up and do something different.
Well, Shakil, I have like 1,000 more questions, but I'm not going to hold you any longer. I feel like a better person after this conversation. I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can people follow the work that you're doing?
Thank you so much. So the title of the book is Deep Diversity, a compassionate scientific approach to achieving racial justice. And it's available at all of your local and your local bookstores. It's available, online. So get it wherever you get your normal books. And if you're interested in this work, please come and join us at my organization. We do lots of events, trainings. We do free things once a month called the Anima Cafe. This month, we'll be talking about what it means to be at the intersection of whiteness, and how do you be authentic and be in relationship when white supremacy, whiteness, and politics all collide. So we'll be talking about that. And that's a free once a month thing we do. You can visit us at animaleadership.com, ANIMA leadership.com.
And the links will be in the show notes. Shakil, thank you so much for your time.
Elaine, it was a real pleasure. Thank you.